In a moment that no one in Washington could have predicted, Denzel Washington walked into a congressional hearing and locked eyes with Chairwoman Maxine Waters. What began as a routine discussion about financial transparency would soon erupt into a confrontation that left the entire chamber frozen. Tonight, you'll discover how one of America's most respected cultural icons challenged decades of political power and delivered a statement so precise, Maxine Waters could not respond. The House Financial Services Committee was not prepared for what was about to unfold. The chamber, usually filled with the restless hum of aides shuffling papers and whispered exchanges between members, had fallen into an uncanny stillness. Every seat was occupied, but no one moved. It was as if the entire room had agreed without a word to hold its breath. Near the far end of the long mahogany witness table, a lone figure stood waiting. Denzel Washington had arrived not as a celebrated actor, but as a citizen, a man who had spent years funding programs to educate low-income communities about financial literacy. He had been invited to offer what the committee had politely described as a civic perspective on transparency and the role of mass communication in shaping public trust. But no one seemed convinced this was just another routine appearance. A ripple of unease ran through the rows of congressional staffers lining the walls. On the left, a senior Democratic advisor shifted in her chair, clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles blanched white. She had read the same leaked memo everyone in this room had seen earlier that morning, the one quoting Denzel's remarks at a closed-door panel just 2 weeks before. He had not softened his words. He had called Congress a machine of selective outrage, more concerned with preserving the illusion of moral authority than confronting its own compromises. It was a sentence that now hovered in the air, unspoken yet vibrating in every glance exchanged across the dais. Chairwoman Maxine Waters watched Denzel with a narrowed gaze that gave nothing away. She was known for her composure, the same unflinching poise she had displayed in countless hearings, as she dismantled CEOs and lobbyists who dared to hedge their answers. But this was different. This time, the witness was not a corporate executive or a bureaucrat skilled in evasive language. He was someone who had nothing to lose by telling the truth as he saw it, someone whose public esteem did not depend on the approval of the committee. A television camera panned slowly across the chamber, capturing the tension in high definition. Even the reporters, accustomed to long afternoons of policy jargon, were unusually still. A producer from a major network adjusted her earpiece and murmured that this might be the moment her channel would lead the evening broadcast. The anticipation in the room was not just curiosity, it felt closer to dread. At the center of that dread was a single question no one wanted to voice. What would happen if Denzel decided not to play along with the polite conventions of the hearing? A clerk cleared his throat and announced that the proceedings would begin. Denzel did not look away from the chairwoman. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had already accepted whatever consequences might come from speaking without calculation. The Democratic advisor swallowed hard and lowered her gaze to the polished table. She could not shake the suspicion that this hearing, scheduled as a modest discussion about public perception, was about to transform into something neither side could fully control. For more than 3 decades, Maxine Waters had built her reputation on a singular promise, that she would never allow the powerful to evade scrutiny. First elected to Congress in 1990, she quickly distinguished herself as one of the fiercest voices in the Democratic caucus, unafraid to confront Wall Street executives and federal regulators alike. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, she had become a symbol of accountability, a figure who could command a hearing room with nothing more than her steady voice and the precise language of a prepared statement. Her questioning had toppled the careers of more than one corporate leader, and even her critics quietly conceded that her command of the technical details was formidable. She had chaired the House Financial Services Committee with a determination that bordered on relentlessness, overseeing hearings that left little space for evasion. Her signature phrase, "I am reclaiming my time," had passed into the lexicon of American politics, a declaration that no witness would be permitted to run out the clock with rehearsed platitudes. Those who underestimated her did so at their peril. Yet for all her experience, there were limits to the authority any single chairperson could wield, and everyone in the room seemed to sense that this afternoon might test those limits in ways few had anticipated. Across the aisle, Denzel Washington sat with his hands folded neatly on the witness table. To millions of Americans, he was an icon of the screen, a performer whose presence could elevate any story into something unforgettable. 2 Academy Awards had not merely affirmed his talent, but had solidified his place in the cultural imagination. But for those who had followed his work off camera, it was his civic engagement that carried an even deeper resonance. For more than 20 years, he had quietly funded scholarships for first-generation college students. He had built community centers in neighborhoods long ignored by policymakers. He had contributed to national initiatives designed to help families understand the mechanics of credit, savings, and homeownership. He never made a spectacle of these commitments, preferring that the work stand on its own. Yet the respect he commanded beyond Hollywood was precisely why his presence today felt unpredictable. He did not owe his credibility to any political party, and his reputation did not hinge on committee approval. Weeks earlier, in a televised forum on civic responsibility, Denzel had spoken with an unusual frankness. He had suggested that Congress itself had become addicted to moral theater, issuing condemnations of corporate influence while accepting donations from the same industries it claimed to regulate. The comment had circulated among staffers and media outlets, drawing swift rebukes. In an interview that followed, Chairwoman Waters had not hesitated to offer her own pointed assessment. She had described Denzel as a talented actor but an amateur in policy, someone whose opinions were shaped by sentiment rather than evidence. That remark had stung precisely because it struck at the heart of what Denzel valued most: the belief that civic participation did not belong only to experts or politicians, but to every citizen willing to speak plainly about injustice. It was this unspoken history that lent an edge to the silence now settling over the room. Some of the junior staffers had only heard rumors of the private tension between the chairwoman and the witness. But the more seasoned aides recognized the expression on Waters's face, the same look she wore when she sensed an opponent was about to test her patience. For her part, Waters did not move her gaze from Denzel. She sat perfectly still, her shoulders squared as if daring him to repeat his criticism to her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the cameras captured the charged stillness with clinical precision. Denzel did not look away. He had come prepared, not merely with a statement, but with a conviction that some truths had to be spoken whether or not they were welcomed. He knew that to many watching, he represented something larger than any film role he had ever played. He represented the idea that cultural influence carried a responsibility to confront hypocrisy, wherever it appeared. Whether that was enough to withstand the force of a seasoned politician determined to protect her legacy remained an open question. The clerk adjusted the microphone and announced that opening statements would begin. Denzel inhaled slowly. Across the long expanse of the table, Maxine Waters' eyes locked with his, 2 legacies about to collide in the unforgiving glare of public record. Chairwoman Waters waited only long enough for the clerk to sit before she began. Her voice was measured, but every syllable carried the edge of a blade carefully honed. "Mr. Washington," she said, "thank you for appearing today. I trust you are prepared to answer questions about the scope of your advocacy and any relationships that might inform your testimony." Denzel inclined his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "Of course, Madam Chairwoman." He spoke quietly, almost as if to deny the room the satisfaction of hearing any tension in his voice. Waters did not blink. "Then let us start with your recent remarks. You have repeatedly described this institution as a machine of selective outrage. You have implied that members of this committee are unwilling to confront their own conflicts of interest." She paused long enough for a murmur to rise among the aides crowded against the back wall. "Would you care to elaborate on what you meant by that?" Denzel folded his hands, choosing his words carefully. "I believe the American people deserve candor. When elected officials criticize corporate influence, they should also be transparent about their own financial relationships. That is not an accusation. It is a standard I believe should apply to everyone. Waters nodded slowly, as if considering whether to let the point pass unanswered. She did not. Mr. Washington, you have used your platform to make sweeping claims about moral consistency. Yet your own financial records are far from uncomplicated. She lifted a folder from her desk and flipped it open with deliberate precision. According to filings published in the Los Angeles Sentinel, you received over $400,000 in honoraria and grants from the Civic Progress Initiative. Are you familiar with that organization? Denzel's gaze did not waver. I am. It is a nonprofit supporting community education. Waters raised an eyebrow. Community education funded in part by a consortium of financial institutions and media conglomerates, some of the same entities you have criticized in your statements. She turned a page, her voice gaining force. Are you suggesting to this committee that your opinions are wholly independent of the money that helps sustain your philanthropic work? A low hush spread across the chamber. A reporter tapped a headline draft into her phone without looking up. The question was not new in principle, but coming from Waters, it acquired a gravity that felt impossible to dismiss. Denzel took a breath, steady but visible. My support for transparency does not depend on who agrees to fund educational programs. I believe in the mission regardless. Waters let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. That is a convenient answer, she said finally, but it is not a complete one. The public has a right to know whether a celebrated figure is using their credibility to advance interests that remain hidden. She turned toward her colleagues, letting her gaze sweep the semicircle of committee members. We are here to protect Americans from information that has been shaped, directly or indirectly, by undisclosed funding. She pivoted back to Denzel. You have described yourself as an advocate for accountability. Tell us plainly, who paid for the distribution of your recent public service announcements about financial literacy? For a moment, Denzel did not answer. The question hung in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. He looked down at the polished surface of the witness table, perhaps collecting his thoughts or perhaps deciding how much he was willing to concede. A staffer on the Republican side shifted in his seat, his expression tight with the awareness that, in this moment, partisan boundaries had little meaning. The spectacle unfolding was not about ideology but about power. Waters waited, her hands folded, her face a mask of patient expectation. Finally, Denzel lifted his eyes. The National Credit Education Partnership contributed partial funding, he said. And yes, some of those funds came through institutions involved in consumer lending. There it was, spoken plainly. The acknowledgement did not sound defensive, but neither did it carry the serene confidence he had shown when he first sat down. Waters allowed herself a slow exhale. Mr. Washington, you have built your reputation on telling Americans they deserve the unvarnished truth. Today, you will offer no less. She leaned slightly forward. Because unlike the stage or the screen, this is not a performance. This is sworn testimony. The gallery rustled with the restless energy of a crowd sensing that something had shifted, that the veneer of mutual respect had cracked just enough to expose the raw contest beneath. For an instant that felt longer than any measured time, no one moved. The room seemed to hold its own breath, suspended between the demand of an authority that had ruled this chamber for decades and the solitary figure who had dared to suggest that authority itself required examination. Denzel sat with his gaze lowered, his hands resting open on the table. He did not fidget. He did not search for an answer. He simply waited, and in that waiting, the tension coiled tighter. Chairwoman Waters watched him without blinking. Her voice, when it finally came, was low but edged with steel. Mr. Washington, she said, you are here under oath. You will respond fully to the committee's questions. You will not deflect. You will not lecture. She paused, her tone hardening to something that no longer even pretended at courtesy. You will answer now. A murmur rippled through the observers packed along the walls. Some of the reporters who had been tapping notes into their phones looked up, recognizing that this was the moment the clip would begin if the confrontation became historic. The clerk swallowed visibly. A junior member of the committee, a freshman representative who had never before seen Waters abandon her polished restraint, glanced toward the ranking Republican as if to confirm that they were witnessing the same thing. The ranking member did not meet her eyes. He stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a thin line. The cameras shifted, capturing each angle of the stalemate. One lens fixed on Denzel's profile, the dark suit that seemed to absorb the harsh overhead lighting, the faint motion of his chest as he drew in a deliberate breath. He did not look up. For 3 long seconds, the only sound in the chamber was the whir of recording equipment and the distant hum of the ventilation system. It was a silence that felt dangerous, like a fault line under pressure. Waters leaned forward. Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but the microphone carried every syllable. "Mr. Washington," she said, "you have used your celebrity to influence public perception. You have called this Congress hypocritical. You have implied that those who serve here care more about their own image than the people they represent." She straightened a single sheet of paper in front of her, her eyes never leaving his face. "You will not walk away from this table without explaining precisely whose money paid for your campaigns." Her words hung in the air, final and absolute. Denzel exhaled, and the sound was as audible as any statement. Slowly, he lifted his head. The lights caught the stillness in his expression, the refusal to perform outrage or fear. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the chamber. "Madam Chairwoman," he said, "if you truly wish to hear the truth, you must allow me to finish it without interruption." A hush deeper than any that had come before settled over the room. No one dared to look away. For the first time since the hearing began, it was impossible to tell which of them held the upper hand. Denzel did not rush. He took a moment that felt like an eternity, letting the silence saturate the air until no one in the chamber could pretend they were simply witnessing a policy discussion. He reached down to his briefcase, the motion unhurried, almost ceremonial. The lock clicked open with a soft, metallic sound that seemed to echo in the expectant hush. With deliberate care, he drew out a thick folder. Its cover was plain, the kind of bureaucratic beige that looked innocuous until you considered the weight it might carry. Chairwoman Waters' gaze tracked every movement. Her hands remained folded on the table, but the line of her shoulders stiffened. A subtle tension drew her posture tighter, as though bracing against an impact she had not anticipated. The aides behind her shifted minutely, exchanging wary glances. A few of them looked down, pretending to read notes they no longer believed mattered. Denzel set the folder flat on the table, his fingers resting on its surface for a single heartbeat. Then he pushed it forward just enough that the label, printed in clean block letters, was visible to every camera. Financial contributions to Chairwoman Maxine Waters, 2014 through 2022. A murmur rose like a gust of wind through the chamber. It was not loud, but it carried the unmistakable pitch of alarm. He lifted his eyes and met hers directly. "Madam Chairwoman, you have asked me to explain who has funded my advocacy. I am prepared to do so, but in the interest of full transparency, the very principle you have insisted must govern all of us. I think the American people deserve to understand the financial context of your own record." He paused, letting the words land. No one interrupted him. Even the clerks had stopped typing. He flipped the folder open. The first page bore a series of tables, lines of figures printed in crisp black ink. The columns listed dates, donor entities, and amounts, numbers that climbed with unsettling speed as the rows advanced. Denzel's voice did not waver. Between 2014 and 2022, the chairwoman's campaign and affiliated committees received more than $1 million in contributions from institutions including Horizon Federal Holdings, Mariner Trust, and Apex Capital Partners. He turned to a second page. Each of these organizations was cited in your own public statements as emblematic of the systemic corruption you have pledged to oppose. A reporter in the gallery let out an audible exhale. The sound broke something in the air like a hairline fracture expanding. For a moment, no one spoke. Waters' lips parted as if she meant to respond, but no words came. Denzel continued, his tone even. "I do not suggest these donations were illegal, nor do I presume they automatically dictate your votes. But if we are to question the integrity of any testimony presented here, we must apply the same scrutiny to every participant, regardless of title." He turned another page. The paper whispered across the microphone. This email from your former campaign finance director was obtained through a lawful records request. He unfolded a printed email, holding it up just enough for the cameras to catch the heading. The text was dense but clear. In it, the staffer explained how certain contributions were routed through intermediary organizations to minimize the appearance of direct support from the financial sector. Denzel read aloud, his voice calm. As discussed, the funds will be dispersed via civic engagement committees to avoid triggering disclosure thresholds in a single quarter. We should prepare talking points about grassroots support to offset any optics issues. He lowered the page and looked at Waters without flinching. I am not here to accuse you of criminal wrongdoing, but I am here to insist that if transparency is the standard you demand of me, it must also be the standard you embrace yourself. The chamber had gone so quiet that every shift of weight in the audience felt amplified. A senior staffer for the majority party closed his eyes for a moment, as if wishing he could unsee the documents arrayed across the table. A young representative, only weeks into her first term, looked from Waters to Denzel and back again, her expression caught between confusion and reluctant respect. Denzel did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He only reached for a second stack of papers. These, he said, are articles published in major outlets that describe you as the most transparent voice in Congress on financial regulation. He thumbed through the pages, stopping to hold up a headline. Chairwoman Waters sets new standard for integrity in campaign finance. He let the title linger where every lens could capture it. I have no doubt your convictions are sincere, Madam Chairwoman. But I think the public deserves to know whether those convictions withstand the same scrutiny you have applied to me. He laid the stack of articles beside the folder of financial records. Waters's eyes flickered, and for the first time in the hearing, she looked down at her notes. Her fingers shifted, pressing the edge of the paper as if searching for something solid to hold. Denzel let the pause expand, not filling it with explanation or apology. When he finally spoke, the words were quiet, but they rang across the chamber with an authority that needed no amplification. I have not been paid to say what I believe. He inclined his head fractionally. Can the same be said by everyone seated here today? Waters's jaw tensed, but still she did not reply. Behind her, a staffer reached for a glass of water with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. The cameras kept recording, capturing every detail of the confrontation neither side could now pretend was anything less than historic. For several long seconds, the chamber remained locked in a kind of suspended animation, as if no one dared to move in case the fragile equilibrium might shatter completely. Chairwoman Waters stared down at the papers in front of her, her expression unreadable. The carefully composed mask she had worn through countless hearings had begun to slip, just enough that even the junior aides could see it. A faint pallor crept into her cheeks, a sign of something she could not disguise, no matter how disciplined her posture remained. Her mouth opened, then closed again, as if she were about to launch the fierce rebuttal that everyone expected from her. But no words came. Instead, she drew in a measured breath and lifted one hand slightly, palm facing the clerk to her left. The young man understood the signal at once, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how much the moment unnerved him. Madam Chairwoman has prepared a statement, he said, reading from a printed sheet. On behalf of the committee, she categorically denies any wrongdoing or any intent to obscure financial records. All campaign contributions have been properly disclosed in compliance with applicable law. As he spoke, Waters kept her gaze fixed on the tabletop, her fingers pressed so flat against the wood it seemed she might splinter it. The denial was clear and unequivocal, but it came not from her own lips, and in that detail, everyone watching could sense that something had shifted irreversibly. The reporters arrayed behind the railing did not wait for the statement to finish. As soon as the clerk lowered the page, a wall of questions erupted. Madam Chairwoman, do you have any documentation to dispute the witness's claims? Can you address the email referencing undisclosed contributions? What do you say to your previous statements about transparency? The questions came from every angle, overlapping in a chorus that drowned out any attempt to answer. Waters did not look up. She reached for the gavel as though to signal adjournment, but her hand paused, hovering inches above the polished block. In the well of the chamber, Denzel remained motionless. He did not gloat. He did not lower his gaze or shift uncomfortably beneath the barrage of camera flashes. He simply waited, letting the moment belong to itself. A producer from a major network, standing near the doorway, murmured into her headset that the footage was already being clipped for the evening broadcast. The phrase she used, which would appear later as a chyron beneath the video, was simple and devastating: moment of reckoning. Within minutes, the clip began its relentless migration across social media. On platforms where most congressional hearings vanished into obscurity, this one ignited a frenzy of commentary. Millions watched as Denzel, calm and deliberate, laid out documents that contradicted the public narrative of the committee's leadership. Some called it the most extraordinary witness testimony in years. Others argued it was a cynical stunt. But even among those inclined to defend Waters, there was no denying that the image of her sitting silent while a citizen read her own records aloud was impossible to ignore. Outside the chamber, a spokesman for the Speaker of the House issued a brief statement confirming that leadership had been made aware of the situation. By evening, the news networks were running live panels speculating on whether a special review committee might be formed to re-examine campaign finance disclosure rules. The phrase transparency crisis began to appear in headlines. Commentators who had once praised Waters for her unflinching oversight now debated whether her authority had been permanently weakened. A junior reporter, barely out of college, stood near the steps of the Capitol, holding her microphone steady as the crowd of journalists jostled for position. In her earpiece, a producer urged her to keep the camera on the exit doors. They all waited to see whether Waters would offer her own defense or slip away without comment. When she finally emerged, she did neither. She walked straight to a waiting car, her expression fixed in a composure so rigid it looked brittle. The door closed behind her, leaving the unanswered questions to multiply in her absence. Inside the building, Denzel gathered his papers without hurry. Someone asked whether he intended to release further documentation, but he only shook his head. His voice was quiet when he finally addressed the reporters pressing in around him. "Trust is not a commodity," he said, each word measured. "It is not something you buy or spend when it suits you. It is the only thing that makes any of this work." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "And it should never be for sale." He walked past the cameras, past the astonished faces of staffers and members who had believed they had seen every possible confrontation unfold in these halls. As he reached the doorway, he turned back just once, long enough to look across the room where a chairwoman had once held absolute command. Then he stepped into the corridor, leaving the storm behind him and carrying nothing but the conviction that no title, no history, no acclaim, could ever be immune to the scrutiny of truth. The days that followed were unlike any in recent memory. By midweek, the Speaker's office announced that the House would convene an extraordinary session to consider new standards for financial disclosure. The language of the resolution was measured, careful not to single out any one individual, but everyone knew what had prompted it. For the first time in years, a sitting committee had voted unanimously to authorize a full audit of every campaign account tied to its members. The move stunned even seasoned observers. Some called it an act of political self-preservation. Others insisted it was proof that no institution, no matter how entrenched, could remain untouched when enough light was cast on its foundations. On the evening the resolution passed, Chairwoman Waters appeared alone in a quiet CNN studio. There was no panel of supporters behind her, no staffer nearby to feed her talking points. She wore a dark suit, her posture composed, but the fatigue was unmistakable around her eyes. The anchor began with the question everyone had waited to hear answered. "Madam Chairwoman, in hindsight, do you believe your committee has upheld the principles of transparency you have championed?" For a moment, Waters did not speak. The silence was different from the silence in the hearing room. Here, it felt almost human, the pause of someone wrestling with an answer too complicated to fit into a sound bite. She looked down at her folded hands, then up again at the camera lens that would carry her words to millions of living rooms. Her throat moved in a slow swallow. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but stripped of the practiced certainties she had carried for so long. "We have worked hard to hold others accountable," she said, "and I have believed in that work with everything I am. But this past week has reminded me that believing in a cause does not absolve you from scrutiny." She drew a quiet breath, her gaze unwavering. "We have not done enough to make our own practices as transparent as they should be. For that, I accept responsibility." The anchor asked if she intended to resign. Waters shook her head once, though there was no defiance in the gesture. "My obligation is to stay and fix what needs to be fixed. I still believe in oversight, but I understand in a way I did not before that it begins with yourself." By the following morning, the clip had been broadcast across every major network. Commentators described it as an extraordinary concession, a moment that blurred the line between personal humility and political necessity. Some saw it as too little too late. Others argued that such an admission, delivered without precondition, carried a rare kind of sincerity. In Washington, where contrition was often transactional, the simple act of saying we did not do enough had an unexpected weight. Inside the Capitol, the staffers who had spent months preparing to defend the committee's reputation moved quickly to adapt. Drafts of new disclosure protocols circulated among offices. Veteran members quietly consulted ethics advisors about whether past contributions would draw further scrutiny. In the hallways, the atmosphere was hushed, as though everyone understood that some threshold had been crossed. A story that began as a single hearing had become something larger, a reckoning that none of them could fully predict or control. On the afternoon when the committee reconvened, the chamber was crowded with reporters, staff, and members who would never again see those seats the same way. When Denzel returned to retrieve the remainder of his documents, he did not slip in unnoticed. A dozen cameras tracked him as he walked the center aisle. He did not appear triumphant, only resolute. As he reached the witness table, he paused, resting his hand for a moment on the stack of papers that had changed the conversation. The gesture was simple, but it carried the quiet conviction that the truth was not a trophy to be brandished. It was a duty to be upheld, no matter how uncomfortable its consequences. He did not speak as he turned toward the door, passing rows of staffers who lowered their eyes as he walked by. Outside the chamber, a reporter called after him, asking whether he believed anything had truly changed. Denzel did not answer immediately. He kept walking until he reached the marble threshold, where the muffled noise of the building gave way to the sharper clarity of the afternoon light. Only then did he glance back over his shoulder, his voice low enough that the cameras had to lean in to catch it. "If we are willing to look in the mirror," he said, "we can rebuild trust. But only if we stop pretending that it was ever unbreakable." He stepped into the corridor, leaving behind a room transformed by the collision of a citizen's conscience and the weight of power. In the days ahead, committees would rewrite their rules, headlines would recede, and the machinery of governance would resume its familiar rhythms. But for everyone who had witnessed that moment, the lesson remained as clear as the silence that had followed his final words. If we dare to look honestly at ourselves, even the hardest truths can be the beginning of something better.